In this lecture, we will learn about for loops and how to work with them in Python. There are times in programming when we want to execute code multiple times. Let's say we wanted to print hello world to the console 5 times. Using the knowledge that we know so far, our option would be to actually write 5 lines of code, one for every time we want to print to the console. But this takes a lot of unnecessary effort and can be time consuming. Also, if we want to change the text being printed, we would have to change the text on all 5 of these lines. In a situation where we know the amount of times we want a block of code to repeat, we can use a control flow statement called the for loop. Let's rewrite this code in the syntax of a for loop. The first step is to use the for keyword. Then we will type I in range. The range function takes in 3 values: start, stop, and step. We will start at 0, stop at 5, and increment by 1 each time. Note that this for loop will execute for the values 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, as it will go up to but not including the stop value. At the end of the line comes a colon. Then comes a print statement to print hello world, indented inside of the for loop. This for loop will tell the computer to print out hello world 5 times. We will break down the code we typed in a moment, but first let's run the code. As you can see, the phrase hello world was printed to the console 5 times. This for loop was able to execute the code inside of it 5 times. Why was that? The key is the 3 statements that come inside of the parentheses of the range function. The first number, 0, is the starting value. The second number, 5, is the stop value. The third number, 1, is the value to increment I by on each successive iteration of the for loop. So I starts out with a value of 0, increases each time the loop is run, and runs while I is less than 5. So the code will run as I equals 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is a total of 5 times. Hence, we get 5 hello world statements logged to the console. When a for loop is executing, each time it is executed is called an iteration. Let's look at another example of how we can use a for loop in Python. This time we are going to write a for loop that will take any string and print the letters out one by one to the console. To start out, let's create a variable named example. We can give it any string we want and the code will work because we are going to write some code that is generic enough to apply to any string. In this example, I will give our variable a value of ABC. Then comes our for loop. We will specify for I in range and start at 0, stop at the length of example, and step by 1 each time. Inside of the for loop, we will print out example at index I. When we run the code, you will notice that A, B, and C were logged to the console. When we iterate over a for loop, it does not have to go forwards. We can also iterate backwards. Let's modify our current example to print out the letters to the console in reverse order. We will start I out at the length of example minus 1. Recall that the elements in our string are indexed 0, 1, and 2, since indexing in Python starts at 0. The length of the string example is 3, so it would be invalid to reference example at index 3 because there is no element at that index. The second argument of our range function is -1, which means that our for loop will iterate starting at any length of example minus 1 backwards down to 0. The third value, the step value, will be -1. Now when we run the code, you will notice that the letters were printed in reverse order to the console, in the order C, B, A. It is also possible to nest for loops. This is when we have a for loop inside of another for loop. The first for loop will start out with I at 0, execute while I is less than 5, and then increment I by 1 each time. The second for loop will start out at j equals 0, execute while j is less than 5, and increment j by 1 each time. Inside of the second for loop, we will print the value of I and j each time. What do you think will happen when we run this code? Okay, I'll ask a better question. Pause the video and write down how many times you think the first for loop will run. Then write down how many times you think the second for loop will run. Then run the code. Are the results as you expected? Note that the first for loop ran 5 times. The second for loop ran 25 times. We can tell this because each time I changed values, all of the values of j, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 were printed. When you have a for loop nested inside of another for loop, The inner loop will execute for all of the iterations, and then the outer loop will execute its next iteration. So every one iteration of the outer for loop resulted in 5 iterations of the inner loop. To recap, here are the key points that we learned about for for loops. A for loop is used to execute a block of code repeatedly when we know the number of needed iterations or times that the code inside of the loop needs to be executed. Also, we can nest loops in Python. In the next lecture, we will learn about while loops and how to work with them in Python.